Logic Lesson 4, Form versus Content. In this lesson, we are going to discuss the distinction between form and content, which will become very important when we think about determining or proving that arguments are valid. But first, a little review. Remember that good arguments are called sound arguments. Sound arguments are good arguments are sound arguments. Sound arguments have two features: all true premises, and they are valid. Remember that valid and true are not the same thing. Valid does not equal true. Statements are true or false, but never valid or invalid. Only reasoning, inferences, and arguments are valid or invalid. And this is because validity has to do with the logical connection between a premise and a conclusion. Arguments are valid when the premises logically imply the conclusion. The conclusion follows logically from the premises. And so how do we know when the premises imply the conclusion or when the conclusion follows from the premises? We have a more precise definition of validity that tells us how to figure that out. And again, be sure that you fully understand this definition. You can't just memorize it. You really need to understand it and know how to apply it in a whole bunch of different cases. So here's the precise definition of validity. You should know it. An argument is valid when... Do you know it? An argument is valid when... If all the premises were true, it would be impossible for the conclusion to be false. Now look, it says if the premises were true. An argument can be valid even if some or all of the premises are false, as long as those premises imply the conclusion. Similarly, an argument can be valid even if the conclusion is false, as long as if the premises were true, the conclusion would have to be true. If you have a valid argument with a false conclusion, what do you know? If you have a valid argument with a false conclusion, you know at least one of the premises must be false. So we remember, validity has to do with the logical connection between the premises and the conclusion. Are the premises connected to the conclusion in such a way that if the premises were true, it would be impossible for the conclusion to be false? When you're trying to decide if an argument is valid, suppose or temporarily assume that the premises are true. Then ask yourself, supposing these premises are true, would it be possible for the conclusion to be false? If the answer to that is yes, even if the premises were true, it would be possible for the conclusion to be false, then the argument is not valid. If the answer is no, the conclusion could not be false if all the premises were true, then the argument is valid. Okay, so make sure you really understand that concept of validity, and if you don't, ask questions, come get help. We also learned how to create counter-arguments to demonstrate that an argument is invalid. To create a counter-argument, you present a possible scenario in which all of the original premises are true. You add some additional detail, which makes the conclusion of the original argument false. Why does this work? You should be able to explain why it is that counter-arguments demonstrate invalidity, and this has to do with the definition of validity. If you can't explain why counter-arguments show that an argument is invalid, you should come get help. Keep in mind that just because you can't think of a counterexample does not mean that the argument is valid. Just because you can't think of a counterexample does not mean that the argument is valid necessarily. Maybe it just means that you lack imagination, or you're tired, just can't think of it right now. So even though counterexamples can certainly prove invalidity, we still don't have a way to prove that an argument is valid, right? And that's what we're going to work on developing next, a way of proving that arguments are valid. So in this lesson, we're going to learn an important distinction, the distinction between form and content, and we're going to use this distinction when we start to prove that arguments are valid. So let me say that again. This distinction between form versus content is going to be very important when we start to develop a method for proving that arguments are valid. Our method we will use is the method of proofs, and according to that method, validity will be determined by the form of an argument, not by its content. So arguments are valid because of their form, not because of their content. So what is form? What do I mean when I say an argument's form? The form of anything is its structure or pattern or shape. Something's form is its pattern, its structure, its shape. Or another way of saying the same thing, something's form is the arrangement of parts relative to the whole. That's what a pattern is, an arrangement of parts relative to the whole. So to give you a better idea of what I mean by form, I'm going to give you some examples of other things other than arguments that have forms. Dress. This dress, different dresses made of the same pattern could have the same form, but not be made of the same material, provided they're made by the same pattern. They have the same form, but not the same material. So dresses are examples of things that have form. They have patterns. They have an arrangement of parts relative to a whole. Here's another example of something that has a form. Lines. So here we have 3 different lines, 3 different equations for each of the different straight lines. The equations for each of the straight lines, though, has the same form. Y equals mx plus b. Each of the straight lines has the same form. The equation for each of the straight lines has the same form, y equals mx plus b, but they have different values for m and b. The green line has a value of 2 for m and a value of 1 for b. The red and blue lines have a value of 0.5 for m and -1, +1, respectively, for b. So again, the different equations for the straight lines have the same form, the same pattern, but different values for m and b. Statements have both form, pattern, shape, and content. 2 different statements, 2 or 3 or 4 different statements can have the same form, logical form, but different content. in the same way that equations for different straight lines have the same form, y equals mx plus b, but different values for m and b. Some statements are in the form of a simple statement. Simple statements assert one single claim. So some statements have the form of a simple statement. They assert one single claim. Here are some examples of simple statements. These examples all have the same form. Philosophy is the love of wisdom. God exists. Free will is an illusion. Humans are morally responsible for their actions. There is an objective moral standard. Now, each of these statements, different content. They have different content, but they have the same form. The form of each of these statements is that they assert one single claim. So while some statements are in the form of a simple statement, other statements are compound statements. So what's a compound statement? Compound statements use logic words either to connect two or more simple statements or to negate a statement. Compound statements use logic words or logical connectors to connect other statements or to negate statements. So logic words that connect, we would call these logical connectors. If then, very important one, if then logical connector. If then connects two simple statements. The statement that goes with the if and the statement that goes with the then are connected by the logical connector if then. Either or just or by itself is another logical connector that connects two simple statements. And is another logical connector that's used to connect two simple statements. If and only if is another logical connector that again connects two simple statements. The form of compound statements is determined by the logical connectors that connect the simple statements in the compound statement. So those are logical connectors that connect two or more simple statements, but logic words can also negate a statement. Logic words that can negate a statement, it is not the case that, it is false that, or any sort of no, not, none, never, so on. Words that negate. Okay, so two compound statements, as I said before, have the same form when they use the same logic words or the same logical connectors. So let's clarify by some examples. Here are some examples of compound statements that have the same logical form but different content. If we have free will, then we have immaterial souls. If we have an idea of the greatest possible being, then the greatest possible being must exist in reality. If there is an objective moral standard, then some people's morals are wrong. So each of these statements has the same logical form. It has the form of an if-then statement, or what we call a conditional statement. Notice that the content of each sentence is different. Different content, same form. Notice also that the logical connector if then is connecting one simple statement, we have free will, with another simple statement, we have immaterial souls. Or again, we have an idea of the greatest possible being, a simple statement connected to the other simple statement, the greatest possible being must exist in reality. These two simple statements connected by the logical connector if-then, conditional. Another example of compound statements with the same form but different content. This time the form is not if-then, the form is either-or. So, either determinism is true, or at least some actions are the result of pure random chance. The form is the form of an either-or statement. We have two simple statements, determinism is true. Some actions are the result of pure random chance, and those two simple statements are connected by the logical connector or. Same thing here. Either God creates the moral law, or the moral law transcends God. Two simple statements connected by the logical connector or. Either the battery is dead, or you are out of gas. Two simple statements connected by the logical connector or. So here we have three examples of three statements that have the same logical form, either or, but different content. Again, here's the logical connector and. Humans have free will, simple statement, and humans are morally responsible for their choices. Two simple statements joined together by the logical connector and. Humans are influenced by their cultures, and different cultures have different moral standards. Two simple statements joined together by the logical connector and. Penguins are birds, and so are ducks. Two simple statements joined together by the logical connective and. All three compound statements have different content, but the same form. The form of these statements is and, or they are conjunctions. Another example. Different content, same form. Humans are morally responsible for their choices if and only if they have free will. Two simple statements joined together by the logical connector if and only if. Morality is objective if and only if God exists. A triangle is equilateral if and only if each angle is 60 degrees. Three different statements, compound statements, same form, different content. The form of these statements we call biconditional, if and only if. Okay, last one. White is not a color. There is no such thing as free will. The view that morality is entirely subjective is false. Three statements, same form. These statements are all in the form of a negation. Each statement negates another statement. The first statement, white is not a color, negates the statement, white is a color. Second statement, there is no such thing as free will, negates the statement, there is free will. Third statement, the view that morality is entirely subjective is false, negates the statement, morality is entirely subjective. These are all in the form of a negation. Again, same form, different content. The form is determined by the logical words in this case. It is not the case that. Okay. Before we go on to talk about how the concept of form is going to help us think about validity, I want to pause here for a moment to make a distinction between asserted statements and unasserted statements. This distinction is going to be important later on. We want to talk about which statements are asserted, which statements are unasserted. An asserted statement is a statement that the author claims is true. An asserted statement is a statement that the author is saying this is true. I'm asserting that this is true. Simple statements are all asserted statements. When an author makes a simple statement, she is claiming or asserting that that statement is true. Compound statements, on the other hand, are often composed of one or more unasserted simple statements. So remember, compound statements use logical connectors to connect two or more simple statements. So the author is not necessarily asserting each of the simple statements. She's only asserting the logical connection between the two statements. Let me explain by example. Here's an example of a compound statement. Either all actions are determined by physical and psychological laws, or some actions happen purely by random chance. So if somebody says this statement, either all actions are determined by physical and psychological laws, or some actions happen purely by random chance, if somebody says that, they're not asserting, they're not claiming that all actions are determined by physical and psychological laws. They're not saying that simple statement is true. Neither are they claiming that some actions happen purely by random chance. Again, they're not asserting that that simple statement is true. What they are asserting is that one or the other, or maybe both, are true. Right? So they're asserting that these two statements are connected in such a way that one or the other must be true. They're not asserting either of the simple statements is true, only the connection between them. Same thing here. If a moral God exists, God must obey an objective moral law. The author is not asserting that a moral God does exist. The author is not asserting that God must obey an objective moral law. The author is only asserting that if the former statement, a moral God exists, is true, then the latter statement, God must obey the moral law, is true. So, the author is not asserting that either of the simple statements is true. The author is only asserting the if-then connection between them. So let's do a little practice, see if you can figure out which simple statements are asserted and which are not. If we are morally responsible for our actions, then we have free will. The sentence has two simple statements. We are morally responsible for our actions, and we have free will. Which, if either of those, is the author asserting is true? The answer is neither. The author is not asserting either that we are morally responsible or that we have free will. The author is only asserting that if the former is true, so the latter will also be true. All men are mortal, and Socrates is a man. Two simple statements, all men are mortal, and Socrates is a man. Which, if any of these simple statements, is the author asserting is true? Okay, in this case, in the case of and, the author actually is asserting both simple statements. He's asserting both that all men are mortal and that Socrates is a man. Try this one. Isaac will graduate this semester if and only if he passes all his classes. So, two simple statements. Isaac will graduate this semester. Isaac passes all his classes. Which, if either of those simple statements, is the author asserting? Neither. The author is not saying that Isaac will graduate this semester. He's not saying that he will pass all his classes. The author is only saying that these two simple statements are logically connected. If one happens, the other will happen. Let's try another. No one can prove that morality is objective. What's the simple statement here? The simple statement is someone could prove morality is objective. Is this simple statement being asserted? No, definitely not. That simple statement is being explicitly denied. God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and morally perfect. Here we really have three statements. God is all-powerful, God is all-knowing, and God is morally perfect. Which, if any of these statements, is being asserted? Okay? In this case, all three are being asserted. The author of this statement is claiming that God is all-powerful, that God is all-knowing, and that God is morally perfect. How about this one? Either God exists but is evil, or God does not exist at all. Here we have three simple statements. God exists, God is evil, God does not exist. Well, really, the last God does not exist is a negation of the first. Which is being asserted, if any? Which, if any of these statements, is being asserted? None. None of the simple statements in this sentence are being asserted. The only thing that's being asserted is a logical relationship between the statements, but this author is not claiming that God exists. He's not claiming that God is evil. He's not claiming that God does not exist. Last one. Humans have immaterial souls that survive the death of their bodies. Here we have just a simple statement. Humans have immaterial souls that survive the death of their bodies. Is it being asserted? Yes. Remember that all simple statements are asserted, unless they're part of a compound statement. Okay. So keep in mind this distinction between asserted and not asserted statements. It's going to come in handy later. It's going to help us understand things as we go along. If you don't understand fully the difference between asserted and unasserted, ask questions about that. And let's move back then to our distinction between form and content. We left off by talking about different statements and how different statements have different forms depending on the logical connector that's used, and that all simple statements have the same form. So, an argument's form is determined by the form of the statements in the argument. So just like statements have a form, arguments have a form. They have a structure, they have a pattern. And the form of the argument depends on the form of the statements in the argument. So again, just like statements, different arguments can have the same logical form, but different content. So let me give you some examples of argument forms. Basic premise 1. If P, then Q, where P or Q could be any simple statement you like, so whatever content you want to put in there. Basic premise 2 asserts that P is true. Therefore, Q is true. So this is a very simple argument form, a very powerful argument form. If P, then Q, P is true, therefore Q is true. So we can fill in whatever content we want for P and Q. Here's an example. If we are morally responsible for our actions, then we have free will. So we are morally responsible for our actions is the content that we're filling in for P. We have free will is the content that we're filling in for Q. We are morally responsible for our actions, therefore we have free will. If P, then Q, P, therefore Q. Here's another argument, same form, different content. If Donald Trump wins the election, then we have a reality star as our president. If P, then Q. Donald Trump did win the election, P, therefore Q. We have a reality star as our president. So, two arguments with different content but the same form. And the validity of the argument is determined not by the content, but by the form of the argument. Let's try another form. Either P or Q. P is false, therefore Q is true. So this argument form is different from the last one. And here again, we can put in whatever simple statement, whatever content we want for P or Q. Either God created the moral standard, or even God is subject to the moral standard. Either P, God created the moral standard, or Q, even God is subject to the moral standard. God is not subject to anything, not Q. Therefore, God created the moral standard. P is true. Either God is the originator of the universe, or something came into existence from nothing. Either P or Q. Something can't come from nothing, so not Q. Therefore, God is the originator of the universe. Therefore, P. Two arguments, different content, same form. So here's an important point. Arguments with valid forms are valid arguments. We don't care about their content. If their form is valid, if their shape, their pattern is valid, then they are a valid argument. Or let me put it this way. It is the form of the argument that tells us the logical connection between the premises and the conclusion. And since validity has to do with the logical connection between the premises and conclusion, we can be concerned with the form, not the content. So, if we can prove that the form of the argument is valid, then we can prove that the argument is valid. We don't have to pay any attention to the content at all. When proving validity, we're just going to ignore the content and pay attention only to the form. Because validity has to do with the logical connection between premises and conclusion, and it's the form of the argument that tells us about the logical connection. In the next lesson, we're going to learn a technique for capturing the form of an argument. We're going to learn how to get the form of the argument and separate it from its content. And that technique is going to get us one step closer to our method for proving validity. But that's for next time. For now, you should be able to tell the difference between the form of a statement or an argument and its content. You should be able to tell when two different statements have the same form but different content. When two different arguments have the same form but different content. You should remember that we will use the form of an argument and not its content to determine whether or not the argument is valid. You should know the difference between a simple statement, and a compound statement. You should know that compound statements use logical connectors to join together simple statements, and that it is the logical connector which determines the form of the compound statement. You should know the difference between an asserted statement and an unasserted statement. In particular, you should be able to tell which simple statements in compound statements are asserted and which are unasserted.